All right, let's jump right in. Today we're going to really get into something that's been making headlines more and more. I mean, everyone's
Mhm.
talking about it, climate change, but specifically how it's impacting human rights.
Yeah, it's definitely moved beyond just being an environmental issue. It's gotten much bigger than that.
Exactly. And to guide our deep dive today, we've got this really interesting study from the UN Human Rights Council. It's called AHRC 5737-AEV.PDS if you want to look it up yourselves. And it just lays out how climate change is basically creating all these obstacles to people being able to, enjoy basic human rights.
And one of the key points that this report really hits on is, the fact that the effects of climate change are not felt equally across the globe.
Yeah, it's not just like everyone's experiencing the same thing everywhere, right?
Right. It's definitely not a level playing field, unfortunately.
No.
Factors like poverty, where you live geographically, historical injustices, even things like discrimination, all of these come together to make some populations way more vulnerable to climate change than others.
Yeah, the report actually uses this term strongly concentrated to describe how these losses and damages, they really hit the poorest and most vulnerable the hardest.
And often these are the people who contributed the least to the problem in the first place.
It's kind of a double whammy, right?
Absolutely.
So let's, bring this global perspective a little closer to home and talk about Southeast Asia, in particular Indonesia.
Hmm.
We've got this other report here, Climate Risk Country-Profile-Indonesia.pdf. And it really paints a concerning picture of how vulnerable Indonesia is to things like extreme weather events.
Oh, yeah. Indonesia is definitely susceptible to those kinds of events, whether it's floods, droughts, you name it. It seems like they're at a high risk.
Yeah, the report says their susceptibility is high. And it's got me thinking about, we've talked about these economic hits, but the UN report also mentions something called non-economic losses and damages. And I think this is where it gets even more interesting. What exactly are we talking about here?
Well, you have to think about the things that often get overlooked when we talk about climate change, things that you can't really put a price tag on, like losing your cultural identity or being displaced from your ancestral lands or even the disruption of traditional knowledge systems. All of these are losses that aren't economic in nature, but they have a huge impact on people's lives and their well-being.
Right. It's like losing more than just money. You're losing a part of who you are. You're losing that connection to your history, your community.
Yeah.
And in a place like Indonesia, where so much of their cultural heritage is tied to the natural environment. I mean, can you imagine the ripple effects if rising sea levels force people to relocate? Or if these extreme weather events we've been talking about disrupt traditional agricultural practices? It's a lot more than just the dollars and cents.
Absolutely. It's a much deeper impact. And I think that brings us to the really big question here. What can we do about all of this? I mean, how do we start to address these really complex challenges, especially in regions like Southeast Asia that are already on the front lines of climate change?
Well, the UN report seems to have a very clear message, and that's that we need to integrate human rights into every aspect of climate action, every level, from the laws and policies to the way we assess climate change risks. It's got to be about more than just the environment we have to protect the rights of the people being affected, especially the most vulnerable communities.
And it gives some really concrete examples of how to do that. Like it
Yeah.
advocates for using a human rights-based approach when it comes to things like climate financing and debt relief mechanisms. And it really stresses the importance of having legal frameworks in place that hold people accountable and ensure that people who are suffering loss and damage due to climate change have access to justice.
So it's not just about throwing money at the problem, right? It's about making sure that money is distributed fairly
Right.
and that people actually have some recourse when their rights are violated. It's got to be about more than just the money.
Exactly. It's a much more nuanced approach.
And you know me, I always like to connect the dots. And all of this talk about human rights and climate change has me thinking about things like food and water security, which are obviously hugely important. We actually have a report here, SDGs 6522024 Progress Report EN Web.pdf. And it really focuses on this idea of transboundary water cooperation, which I think is more important than ever in the face of climate change. It's adding a whole other layer of complexity.
Absolutely. And this is particularly relevant for a place like Southeast Asia. It's a region that's just crisscrossed with these shared river basins, and climate change is already impacting water availability. I mean, we're seeing more frequent and more intense floods and droughts.
Yeah, and this report highlights something that I think is pretty startling. While 50% of river basins have coordinated alarm systems in place for floods, only 14% have actually adopted joint strategies for adapting to climate change. I mean, that's a pretty big gap.
It is a big gap, and that's precisely why this idea of transboundary cooperation is so crucial. It's about countries in the region coming together to manage these shared water resources. It's the only way forward.
It's like creating a regional safety net, right?
Mhm.
working together to make sure everyone has access to water, even as climate change throws all these curveballs our way.
But
But let's shift gears a bit and look at the economic side of things. We have the CD0991N.PDF report, which is the OECD-FAO Agricultural Outlook, and it has some really interesting insights into where global agricultural markets might be headed.
Yeah.
What are some of the key takeaways here, especially in the context of what we've been discussing today?
well, one of the things that really jumps out is the projection that global agricultural demand growth is going to slow down over the next decade. This is partially because population growth is slowing, but it's also because per capita income growth is expected to be moderate in a lot of countries over that period.
So basically less demand
Yeah.
overall, right?
Yeah, but here's the thing. Even with that overall slowdown, food consumption in lower and middle income countries is actually projected to increase.
So it's like two sides of the same coin, right?
Right.
Less demand globally, but more consumption in specific regions.
Exactly. And this creates both challenges and opportunities, particularly for a region like Southeast Asia. How will these global trends play out in a place like Indonesia, which is a major player in the agricultural sector?
Right. I mean, we could see things like increased price volatility, shifts in trade patterns, even impacts on food security. It's a whole web of interconnected factors.
And understanding these global trends is absolutely crucial. Countries like Indonesia need this information to make smart decisions about agricultural policies, investments, even trade strategies. They need to be prepared.
All right, so we've talked about the global picture, the regional picture, and now let's bring it back to that UN Human Rights Council report. It doesn't just lay out the problems, it also calls for some pretty specific action. And two terms that really jumped out at me were climate justice and climate reparations. I mean, these are terms that are getting thrown around a lot these days. But what do they really mean, especially in this context?
Well, climate justice is really about acknowledging that the impacts of climate change aren't felt equally, and that the people who are often hit the hardest are the ones who contributed the least to the problem. It's about addressing the historical and systemic injustices that are tied to climate change.
And climate reparations kind of take that a step further, right?
Exactly. It's basically saying that developed nations, through their industrialization and high carbon emissions, have played a huge role in creating the climate crisis, and that they have a moral obligation to provide both financial and technological support to those developing countries who are suffering the consequences, even though they had very little to do with causing it.
So it's not just about aid, it's about making amends for past actions, right?
Right. It's about taking responsibility and making sure that those who benefited from polluting activities are now helping to fix the problem. And it goes beyond just financial aid. It's also about sharing technology, building capacity, and supporting climate resilience in these more vulnerable nations.
It sounds like a call for a true global partnership, right? Recognizing that this is a challenge we all share and we need to work together to address it. But the UN report gets even more granular than that. There's this one line that really stood out to me. It says, diverse forms of reparations, guarantees of non-recurrence and truth-seeking could also redress holistically the non-economic dimensions of loss and damage. Well, that's a bit of a mouthful, but what does it actually mean in practical terms?
Well, it's acknowledging that climate change doesn't just cause physical and economic damage. Think about it. Imagine losing your ancestral home, your cultural heritage, your very sense of belonging, all because of climate change. Those are losses you can't really measure in dollars and cents. And the report is saying that those losses need to be addressed as part of this whole idea of climate justice.
Right. It's not just about the money. It's about recognizing the emotional, the cultural, the spiritual dimensions of climate change.
Absolutely. It's about healing reconciliation and making sure that these kinds of injustices aren't repeated in the future. Yeah, it's about acknowledging those deeper wounds and working towards some kind of restoration. And it's not just about holding nations accountable either. The report also calls out businesses. I mean, they have a role to play in this too, especially those who bear some responsibility for climate change.
So we're talking about corporate accountability,
Yeah.
maybe even climate litigation,
Right.
right? I mean, it's like we're adding this whole other layer to the climate puzzle.
Yeah.
Now, it's not just about cutting emissions. It's also about, righting those past wrongs and making sure that the folks who actually profited from those activities that fueled climate change are contributing to the solutions.
Yeah, right. It's about sharing the burden fairly, and I think this is a conversation that's only going to get louder and more intense in the coming years, especially as we see the impacts of climate change becoming more severe and the demands for accountability grow stronger. But, it's important to remember that even amidst all this talk about loss and damage and vulnerability and reparations, the UN report also strikes a note of hope. I mean, it emphasizes that we need collective action to move forward.
Yeah, it's not just doom and gloom, right? It's about channeling all this energy and concern into something productive. into actions that can actually make a difference.
Exactly. The report ends with this really powerful call to action, urging states to put human rights at the center of everything they do when it comes to climate change. And it's a reminder that even though the challenges are huge, we have the tools and the knowledge to create a future that's both just and sustainable. It's going to take collaboration, innovation, and a real commitment to leaving a healthier planet for the generations that come after us.
Speaking of a healthier planet, let's talk about something that's been in the news a lot lately: extreme heat. We've got this report right here. United Nations Secretary General's Call to Action on Extreme Heat.pdf. And it's a pretty stark reminder that climate change is turning up the heat literally, and it's having some serious consequences.
No kidding. I mean, extreme heat is a major threat to human health, especially for vulnerable populations. Think about older adults, children, people with underlying health conditions, anyone living in poverty. It's not just uncomfortable, it can be downright deadly.
And it's not just a health issue either. I mean, extreme heat can disrupt economies, damage infrastructure, fuel wildfires. It's like a cascade of negative effects.
Oh, yeah, the ripple effects are huge. The report talks about how it can reduce worker productivity, strain energy grids, disrupt transportation systems. It really impacts every part of society and the economy.
So what can we do about it? I mean, this report sounds pretty urgent.
It is. It stresses that we need to take action now to protect people and systems from extreme heat. And it calls for a multi-pronged approach. Things like evidence-based policies, stronger social safety nets, robust early warning systems. It's about being prepared.
So kind of like having a specialized weather forecast just for extreme heat, so
Yeah.
people can know what's coming and take precautions.
Exactly. Knowledge is power in these situations. And of course, as with climate change in general, the impacts of extreme heat are not evenly distributed. Some regions and communities are going to be hit harder than others, and they're going to need targeted support.
So we need to make sure those resources are going where they're needed most. We've covered a lot today, from those broad human rights implications of climate change to the very real threat of extreme heat and everything in between. It's clear that these are some really complex and interconnected challenges. But before we wrap up, I want to bring it back to the economy for a minute, especially given all the reports we've been looking at today.
Yeah, the economic implications of climate change are massive and multifaceted. But if I had to pick one area that's absolutely crucial to consider, I'd say it's agriculture, particularly for a region like Southeast Asia, which is so heavily reliant on agriculture for both food security and livelihoods.
Right, and that takes us back to the OECD-FAO Agricultural Outlook Report, CD0991N.pdf. It's packed with data and projections. But what are the key takeaways here, especially for our conversation today?
Well, one of the big things is the projection that global agricultural demand growth is going to slow down significantly over the next 10 years. This is mainly due to slower population growth and more moderate income growth in a lot of countries.
So less demand overall. But we were talking earlier about how food consumption in certain regions is actually projected to increase. So it's a bit of a paradox, right?
It is, and that's what makes it so interesting. There are both opportunities and challenges here. For countries like Indonesia, there's potential to really tap into those growing markets, but there's also the risk of increased competition, price volatility, and the need to adapt to those changing consumer preferences.
And then you layer on top of that the whole wild card of climate change itself. I mean, extreme weather, changing rain patterns, rising temperatures, all of those can disrupt agricultural production and throw the whole market into uncertainty.
Absolutely. It all points to the need for more climate-resilient agricultural practices, particularly in regions like Southeast Asia that are really vulnerable to those climate change impacts. It's about creating a food system that can withstand the shocks and still ensure food security for a growing population, even as the climate is changing around us.
So it's about building resilience and adaptability into the system.
Exactly. And the OECD-FAO report also gets into some specific commodity markets. Are there any trends there that stand out as particularly relevant to Southeast Asia?
Yeah, actually, I was curious about that. What did you find?
Well, one thing that caught my eye was the projection that global rice production is going to continue to increase over the next decade, driven by yield improvements and steady demand. This is really important for Southeast Asia because it's a major rice-producing region. Rice is a staple food for millions of people there.
So those production trends have a direct impact on food security and livelihoods across the region. It's all connected.
It really is. And what about other key commodities? Anything else that stood out?
Well, the report also mentioned that the global sugar market is expected to grow steadily over the next decade, with increasing demand coming from those developing countries. And this is particularly relevant for Indonesia because they're a significant sugar producer.
So on the one hand, there's this potential opportunity for Indonesia to expand its sugar exports. But on the other hand, there's also the challenge of ensuring that domestic demand is met and that the whole production process is sustainable in the face of climate change. It's a balancing act.
It is. It's about meeting those domestic needs, capitalizing on those export opportunities, but also making sure that they're doing it in a way that's environmentally sound. And of course, climate change just adds another layer of complexity to all of that.
Absolutely. It's a complicated equation, but amidst all this focus on the economic side of things, it's important to remember that behind all these statistics and projections, there are real people whose lives are being shaped by these global forces.
Right. We can't forget the human element.
Exactly. It's about understanding how these trends actually play out in people's everyday lives, whether it's a farmer who's dealing with those unpredictable weather patterns, or a family struggling to afford food as prices go up, or even an entire community that's being forced to relocate because their traditional way of life is no longer viable.
It's about making those connections between the global and the local, the economic and the social, and remembering that we're all in this together.
That's exactly it. It's about that shared responsibility, and that's what we need to really address the complexity of climate change.
It's not just an environmental issue, it's a human issue, a social issue, an economic issue. And the solutions have to be just and equitable for everyone.
It's about bringing together all these different threads, the science, the policy, the economics, the human rights, and weaving them into a tapestry of solutions that can actually tackle this multifaceted challenge.
So it's not about picking one approach over another, it's about recognizing that we need an integrated approach, a holistic approach.
Exactly. And it's about understanding that all these issues are interconnected and that the solutions we come up with in one area can have ripple effects in others. It's all part of the same system. Now, speaking of interconnectedness, the UN Human Rights Council report touches on something called loss and damage, and it seems like that's becoming a really key concept in a lot of these climate change discussions these days. Can you break down what that actually means?
Yeah, I was wondering about that too. It sounds pretty serious.
It is loss and damage basically refers to all of the negative consequences of climate change that go beyond what people and systems can adapt to. It's about those impacts that are so severe or so widespread that they cause irreversible losses or irreparable harm.
So we're talking about things you can't just bounce back from, the kind of impacts that leave permanent scars.
Exactly. It could be the loss of coastal land due to rising sea levels, or the destruction of infrastructure from extreme weather, or even the displacement of whole communities because of climate disasters. And the UN report makes it very clear that these losses and damages are not distributed equally. The most vulnerable communities and nations are often the ones who get hit the hardest, even though they did the least to cause the problem.
Yeah, it's like that old saying, you reap what you sow. But in this case, the folks who reaped all the benefits of industrialization are now asking those who barely participated to bear the brunt of the consequences.
Yeah, it really is a case of those who benefited the most now asking others to shoulder the burden. And that's where this whole concept of climate justice comes into play. It's recognizing that the responsibility for climate change and its impacts isn't shared equally, and this leads to the idea of climate reparations. It's definitely a complex and somewhat controversial issue, but it's gaining traction in those international discussions.
Yeah, and the basic idea is that those developed nations, through their industrialization and high carbon emissions, have played a big role in creating this climate crisis. And now there's this growing sense that they have a moral obligation to provide support to developing nations who are bearing the brunt of the consequences, even though their contribution to the problem was minimal.
It's about acknowledging those past wrongs and taking steps to ensure that those who profited from polluting activities are now contributing to the solutions. And it goes beyond just financial aid. It's about sharing technology, building capacity, and supporting those efforts to build climate resilience in those vulnerable nations.
So it's a call for a global partnership, a recognition that this is a shared challenge that demands a collective response. But the UN report goes even further. There's this one line that really jumped out at me. It says, diverse forms of reparations, guarantees of non-recurrence and truth-seeking could also redress holistically the non-economic dimensions of loss and damage. That's a lot to unpack, but what does it actually mean, practically speaking?
Well, it's acknowledging that climate change doesn't just inflict damage that's physical or economic. Imagine losing your ancestral home, your cultural heritage, your sense of belonging because of climate change. Those are non-economic losses, and the report is emphasizing that those losses need to be addressed as part of this holistic approach to climate justice.
So it goes beyond just the dollars and cents. It's about recognizing the emotional, cultural, and spiritual dimensions of climate change.
Absolutely. It's about healing reconciliation and ensuring that these kinds of injustices aren't repeated.
Wow, we've covered so much ground today.
Mm.
We've gone from these broad human rights implications of climate change to the very real and immediate threat of extreme heat. We talked about the vulnerabilities and the opportunities facing Indonesia and Southeast Asia, and we even delved into the complex interplay of food security, economic trends, and global responsibility in a world that's constantly changing.
And through it all, we've seen how climate change isn't just an environmental issue. It's a human rights issue, a social issue, and an economic issue. And the reports we've discussed today offer a roadmap of sorts. They highlight the importance of collective action, the need for solutions that are rooted in equity, and the potential for international cooperation to chart a path towards a future that's more just and sustainable.
A future where we're not just mitigating the impacts of climate change, but also addressing the historical injustices, that it's created a future where everyone has the chance to thrive on a healthy and resilient planet. This deep dive has been eye-opening, and it's clear that the conversation is far from over. We encourage you to check out the source material for yourselves and to stay engaged with this incredibly important topic. Thanks for joining us,